So an energy-saving light bulb might resonate with one side of the aisle, while if you might call it the freedom bulb, it might resonate with the other side of the aisle. And so I think it's the same product, the same electrons flow through it, but you're just emphasizing different outcomes.
Welcome back to Wicked Problems. I am Richard Delavan, and what if the term climate tech, which is part of this show's title, has outlived its usefulness? Not because the work is done, but because the story has shifted. And this week on Wicked Problems, I'm joined by Art Lapinsch, founder of Delphi Zero, writer, former startup founder, and trained energy lawyer. He helps climate leaders rethink narratives and communications when the moment has moved faster than the message. In this episode, we unpack whether climate tech is dead as a term, how teams decide when to pivot or persevere, and why messaging frameworks sometimes collapse just when they're most needed.
Yeah, what an intro.
Well, you've got a fascinating background, and we've got some mutuals in common who put us in touch in Athens. So our shout out to Maureen Buja and to Fred. Hope you guys are well. So here we go with a long-awaited conversation, which Maureen was been like, why hasn't this happened yet? But look, so first of all, just take me just for a short trip through your CV in terms of deciding to found Delphi Zero. Like what is the mission for what you're trying to do there?
He used to be a co-founder in the advertising technology space, where we took programmatic advertising into the recruitment space from 2015 through 2019 with my co-founders. And after a sabbatical, I was looking for something else to do. And with the full-scale invasion of Russia into Ukraine, things changed for me. So a little bit of personal background. I was born in the Soviet Union, so currently Russian territory. My parents then moved with me as a baby to former Yugoslavia. As the civil war started over there, we were lucky enough to get out and eventually ended up in Vienna, Austria. So I'm Austrian, grew up there since I was like 2 years old.
Wow.
But yeah, I like to say that the first two countries where I lived in my life don't exist anymore. Is that real?
And do you have much Russian or Serbo-Croat?
I do speak it, I understand it, and for a Croat, I do understand it more than I speak it.
Okay. Well, I mean, I'm not going to try my Russian out on you. I only did a couple of semesters, and I can say Yeltsin, and that's basically about it. A few other things.
Yeah, well, so with the invasion, I think the war in itself just felt deeply personal because we did have, or we still have a lot of friends who are in Ukraine, and it just felt completely unfair. Like what was happening to them just for no reason, being attacked. And then secondly, as a taxpayer in Germany, I felt frustrated that the public pressure and the policy pressure that they put on Russia was non-existent, especially in the early days. So I tried to figure out why. And so then stumbled into this entire topic of energy security and energy supply contracts, so like Russian gas into Europe, and was actually really interested in the topic. So dove down the rabbit hole. And after a while, I said, well, if I spend 10 to 12 hours a day reading and thinking about this topic anyway, might as well pivot into a new career direction. Went back to school, studied energy law, and now, as you mentioned, write, consult, and occasionally also angel invest in the climate topic. So the mission of Delphi Zero is to explain concepts, high-level concepts in climate in human readable language, because this was my early frustration in this space. Either you needed a PhD from MIT, what it felt like to read these white papers,
Right.
or on the other end of the spectrum, you had UN policy papers, which were 5 bullet points, which are so abstract that they didn't make sense to me.
Right. And it is definitely a space where I think you and I are of one mind in the sense that being better storytellers, better communicators on topics like this has definitely been something that's held back a lot of climate action simply because it's just, science communications is something that is just tough on any field, and one that has this much at stake, it does change the game a little bit. So, well, let's talk a little bit about the topic we were going to get into, which is this climate tech as a thing, as a term, has a recent vintage. It came to supplant, at least for a time, clean tech, which was more associated with the first wave in like 09 and 10, and became associated with things like Solyndra, the solar startup in the US that didn't make it. For some people, David Hunt, I know, is a listener, so no shade on David or deciding to keep clean tech as part of the thing. But is that the term climate tech We see a lot of people talking about this. We've talked about it on the show with Freya Pratty from Sifted. Is it dead?
I don't think so. Well, the way I would look at it is through the lens of an evolution of an industry, right? So I can compare it to advertising technology because that's the space I'm most familiar with. And in the early days, you would have a bucket where all the different companies would fall into, and that was ad tech. But the more the industry grew and the more specialization you had, the more specialized the terminology became. It was like more and more specific. So you had supply side solutions, you had demand side solutions, and my guess would be climate tech as a umbrella term, probably still meaningful, but it does make sense to be more intentional around branding the category that you're in. And so whether you're like an energy tech or restoration tech or whatever, I think that can still fit within climate tech. So it's not dead, but I think we'll just see more fidelity in how you describe different solutions.
Right. So it's a kind of a genus species kind of thing in terms of a hierarchy of grouping. Okay. I mean, so I guess to put the opposite question, what do we lose by dropping it? I mean, like, I suppose like one of the other cross currents is that obviously the political environment has changed over the last 12, 18 months in the West when it comes to
Mhm.
discussing climate. I think it would be very surprising if we were to, put a bunch of folk in investment and founders under polygraph and ask them to say, is that the reason you're running away from the term climate? And for them to truthfully answer, I just suspect that very few of them could honestly say that's nothing to do with it. So, what do we lose by dropping it if it were to be dropped? Do you think?
Good question. What do we lose? Well, I think maybe you lose kind of like built up narratives and kind of like understood stories that you've been telling over many, many years. Kind of like
Hmm.
institutional knowledge might be tossed away. But overall, I don't think on a business level it would be that painful. So just like one random example I could give is if you think about energy saving light bulbs, I always ask myself, for example, in the US, you have two different constituencies who respond very, very differently to different messaging. And so an energy saving light bulb might resonate with one side of the aisle, while if you might call it the freedom bulb, it might resonate with the other side of the aisle. I think it's the same product, the same electrons flow through it, but you're just emphasizing different outcomes. Like one is focused more on decarbonization, the other one is more on energy security and resilience, kind of national security. And so both are a feature of the same product. It's just a question of how do you explain it and communicate it to
Right.
the different audiences that you have.
But I suppose in the end, like, if you're doing that classic 30-second elevator pitch for funding or for, explain what your company is, you got to come down on one side or the other, right? Messaging, you can, as again, having worked in ed tech myself, you can split up,
Sure.
when you're going to a personalized, individuated audience. But, in the end, there needs to be one, unifying narrative and theme, right? So how do you decide in an environment like this? What are you telling your clients? What are you telling people that, you're working with at Delphi?
Yeah, I mean, I guess like the first question would be like, what is communication about, and like why do we need it? I think at a very fundamental level, communication is kind of the superpower that we have as humans. So I think about the Apollo project. How do you organize or align 100,000 of people to work on the same project? It's just like by transmitting and then implanting a idea in a lot of people. So you don't do it by cutting them up and placing it in there. You just like communicate that idea in a way that resonates with them. So once you understand that communication is about transferring ideas, I think one very helpful framework is the Shannon Weaver model of communication. One of my grad school teachers, he said, is the mother of all models. It was originally a computer science and mathematics model, but at the very fundamental level, it just breaks down communication into like a sender and the receiver. So the sender tries to send the message to the receiver over a channel. So, for example, for us, I'm the sender. We're talking over this podcast. We have an internet connection. That's the channel. And the two important things are I encode my idea. So, kind of, I try to phrase it with words and verbiage that hopefully you can decode.
Hmm.
And if encoding and decoding matches, that's resonance. So you have like resonant frequencies. And I would say as a business, it is important to understand first what is the idea that you're trying to communicate, then secondly, like to whom. And then most importantly is just like try to understand like what the language is that your counterpart already understands. Unless
Right.
you're trying to invent new terminology and educate the market. But even then, you should be aware of kind of are they more professional? Are they more personable and so on? And so
Right.
then try to communicate it in terms that matter to them.
Right. And so again, so you're really centering the audience and figuring out what's important to them, what they actually believe already, values wise, et cetera, with things that are going to resonate. And I love that you mentioned the Apollo program, and I love that I've gone back to that Rice speech in 1962 that JFK delivered, tons of times because it's just so good. We'll probably play a clip.
Yeah.
But he's appealing to a quite jingoistic, quite kind of aggressive, quite nationalist view most of the speech, and at the very end comes back to the fact that if we don't do it, then the bad guys will own space, and if they own space, that's bad. And I hear that argument now being trotted out about AI quite a lot when it comes to why does America need to dominate the AI space? Well, we
Mhm.
need to make the world safe, good AI, not bad AI.
Mhm.
So yeah, I suppose these things do tend to continue. So what would be? I mean, again, so you've already mentioned what would be good about being specific. Again, more intentional with deciding to go a little bit down and more specific in differentiating for a founding team. What they're trying to do, and I suppose that depending on the audience, I guess the question would be at this moment in time, that's good if you're trying to raise money and you might be raising money from funds who get into defense tech. Reframing the problem around being defense about something else probably is going to get you some points. But what would the overall discourse lose if if people do shy away from this term in your view? Then I just want to come back to the kind of the pivot or persevere bit in a moment. But basically, as a community, as a for global discourse, I mean, it just feels to me like the stakes of deciding to decenter the word climate are not nothing.
I agree. Although I would challenge this and I would, what are we trying to optimize for? Is it the discourse or the outcomes? What matters is ultimately that we decarbonize and emit fewer greenhouse gases into the atmosphere and potentially even take some molecules out of the atmosphere. Maybe you can do that also with a completely new discourse. So maybe even the emphasis on national security and resilience still is mainly driven by deployment of renewable energy technologies.
Hmm.
And so I wouldn't care necessarily that this course has shifted as long as we reach our goal.
Well, I'm actually on your team here, but I'm trying to channel my inner Keaton Joshi or Dave Vedder, who I think have slightly different views about whether the consequences of that.
Mhm.
I'm a pretty ruthless pragmatist when it comes to this stuff. Once someone asked me, about what like a title bump when I was working in an agency in Chicago, I said, I don't care if you call me the janitor, just pay me.
Yeah,
Like I don't
exactly. Yeah. Well, I mean, I guess one of the big risks is overall kind of like we perceive our worlds like through our own lens, right? And so our brain tries to emphasize things that are top of mind and de-emphasize things that are less top of mind. So if
Mm-hmm.
we have fewer instances where we even think about the climate, nature, kind of
Yeah.
the health of the environment, then maybe over time, culturally, we will just lose this focus or kind of like the importance of these objectives. So maybe this is the risk, but who am I to evaluate whether that's actually happening? But that might be one of the major risks.
Well, I suppose, but your day to day, right, is in part you're helping to advise, companies, founding teams, various others in terms of how they structure, how they think about this stuff. So, I mean, again, we've both worked in startups, and again, I like the term, kind of the lean startup approach, where there's a moment that comes in the life of every young company, where the founding team needs to sit down or management needs to sit down and go okay, are we continuing on with this thesis? Is this right? Is the data telling us that this is the right thing? Or do we pivot? Do we move to something else? Do we decide we're attacking the wrong market segment, we're going in the wrong direction? And when it comes to comms, I just wonder how do we apply some of that when it comes to, people that you're advising, like that thinking? Is that something that enters into, how you conceive of these choices that people have to make?
Yeah, of course, because the there's a huge difference whether we look at the problem that we're trying to solve as like all of society versus like one singular business. Because similar to what you said, if you're not a title hunter, you might as well be called janitor. What you care is that you get paid. So for a business, I think the objective of business on a very fundamental level is to make a profit and potentially grow, right? Of course, if you're in the climate space and if you have convictions about doing something good, introducing new technologies that might be helpful for decarbonization, that's another thing. But at a very fundamental level, if you are analyzing how you communicate to the market, your question is like, how do you make this business as successful as possible? First, you have to know like who your audience is. Once you understand the audience, one very helpful framework that I like to use and tell to my clients is something that I've learned from the founder of the Comedy Cellar. The fundamental structure of any story is who wants what and what's in the way. So you
Mm.
have the subject, you have a desire, and you have a complication. And in a business setting, you will see that most customers who want to buy a service are facing like a similar conundrum, right? They are the subject of their own story, they have a desire,
Mm-hmm.
and ultimately your product should be the thing that solves the complication within
Right.
their own story. So an easy way, once you have access to your customers, is just to have conversations with them and literally ask them, what's the single biggest problem that keeps you up at night?
Mm-hmm.
What is your biggest fear as a business owner? And try to understand their answers as good as possible. There's a technique called laddering. You can ladder up by asking why, or ladder down by asking how. Once you're trying to drill down into the core of the problem, I would recommend laddering up. So if you tell me your biggest problem is growing your podcast, I would ask why. Well, just because I want to have more people listening to it, like why? And then at the end, maybe you tell me
Mm.
that your purpose for this podcast is to make a dent in kind of like as many people's lives to start caring about this particular topic. So if I then have some sort of solution where it's like, look, I will consult you with my services to make sure most people who hear your podcast once will start referring it to their friends. And so that way you might end up growing your business. That's how I would suggest people to approach it.
Right, right. And in terms of the language itself, and again, that's where we started. So, and again, it's something that you specialize in and helping to help people decide this. I think we talked a little bit about like neologisms, right? The idea of coming up with a whole different term. And again, someone at some point came up with the term climate tech as a way that encapsulated something and differentiated it from what had come before. At that time, I couldn't tell you the etymology of exactly how that caught on, but at some point it did. Um, what are the role of neologisms and like who gets to decide? I mean, is it a wise thing for a company to try and invent one in order to be able to kind of own market space? And this applies to corporates, it applies to startups. It's something that I have had conversations about over the last 30 years with companies of like, should we try to coin a term or not?
Yeah. So a couple of thoughts on that. First one, you had mentioned climate tech followed after clean tech. And I think clean tech had one of the issues that it was a very loaded term.
Hmm.
People associated it with failure and kind of a lot of capital being just like lit up and burned. So I think in that context, it does make sense to have a fresh start with a new term for pretty much like the same thing, but like slightly later in time. Neologisms or just like in general, repositioning, rebranding can have positives if you're trying to shift away from something that's been loaded with associations.
Can I, for 1 second there? Sorry, I can see it. There's about to be a disturbance in the force in the background there. So
No worries,
give,
no
give
worries.
me
Yeah.
1 second. Apologies. Sorry about that.
No, no problem.
Yeah, we've dodged a bullet, I think, on that front. But we were talking neologisms.
No
Like,
worries.
I'm not sure what show it was. I was hearing Pete Buttigieg, the former Secretary of Transportation, former mayor of South Bend, Indiana, who basically was on one of these manosphere 3 hour, 5 hour podcast marathon things.
Hmm.
Um, and at like one point, the host got up and used the toilets, and basically, like the rest of the crew just kind of kept chattering away, and they were like, "It's all like live streamed out." So yeah, I mean, we'll probably edit that bit out, but it was like, I'm amazed that people were like, people are trying to get their
Doing
heads
it
around.
live.
So you were saying, sorry.
Yeah, I mean, just pretty much like as an industry, if you move away from a loaded term, that's helpful. But I think if you look at something from a company perspective, in general, neologisms, specifically if you're talking about defining the category,
Mm,
I think personally are very, very helpful. There is some research, and I'll try to find an essential link to it, that within technology industries, the category leader
mm,
takes 80% of the profits of the category.
right.
So once you are competing in an established category, that's a very, very bad idea unless you have a
Right.
much better product. So it's much easier to come up with a new term that defines a new category in a more specific way. And so from that angle, I would say that it's definitely helpful to come up with neologisms.
I, I mean, again, that feels a lot like something Peter Thiel might advise, certainly in his book Zero to One, and him and Blake Masters commenting on like, what do you do? How do you actually corner the market on something? You know, you corner the market on something small,
Yep.
you know, and one of the things that I think that Mark Zuckerberg was already doing that with Facebook, but certainly it's part of what I think appealed to Peter Thiel being the first investor in there was the market approach of like, we're going to own universities. First, we're going to own Harvard. Then we're for this thing. Then we're going to own the rest of the college sector and that, you know, elite colleges, and then other people would want to be part of the elite college thing, and then we'll kind of grow it like concentric circles out. And you know, it's hard to argue that that didn't work. So, let's talk a little bit about the ethics of this, right? So, I just mentioned deliberately Peter Thiel and Facebook, which have run into some complications. I think your work at Delphi Zero and writing on your Substack, you argue communication is like how we interact with end fate. What do you mean by that?
And good question. I wouldn't even remember where I wrote this.
Well,
One thing that I,
how do you make these things ethical? I guess is the underlying thought there.
yeah, before I answer that question, I just wanted to quickly give an additional detail. So I think a neologism technically is coming up with a term that doesn't exist yet. So something like Google with the
Right.
two also as a neologism, but I think category definition technically is not a neologism. So if you say programmatic recruitment, it's not a neologism. It's just like a new category definition.
Fair enough.
So ethical, how do you make stuff ethical? I mean, the first question is like, do you even care about ethics? I mean, I do, but maybe there are some people who don't care about ethics. I remember seeing this Venn diagram once, which had three circles. One was profitable, second one was legal, and third one was ethical. And so depending on where you would draw the lines, for example, taking ethical away and just have legal and profitable, or even taking legal away and profitable, you come up with completely different industries to build a business in.
Right.
Yeah, overall, I think ethics is probably just like a cultural thing, right? So like, what are the values? What are the ideas that you're imbued over time, and which ones do you believe in? And for ethical communication, I'd say there's like a high level. So one is kind of what are the ultimate goals? What's the vision of the world that you believe in and that you would like other people to see? That's kind of like on a high level in terms of ethical communications. Ideally, it's a good version of the world where most people, or ideally all people, benefit from it, and you don't have some sort of segmentation where there are very clear winners and losers and a lot of losers based on certain markers, nationalities, social status, and so on. And then like on a granular level, ethical communication, I guess this gets into kind of communication techniques, communication channels, like hacking attention. But I'm not an expert in specifically this level of fidelity of communication.
Mm.
So I'll leave it at that.
Yeah, fair enough. I mean, yeah. I again kind of came up. My first jobs being in politics and then communications and something involving, you know, from the first time I read Edward Bernays, Sigmund Freud's nephew, who wrote, advised a lot of companies in the very early days before we even called it PR about like using symbol and spectacle, to tap into things that were kind of pre-rational to be able to convince people to change their behavior in ways that were pretty novel for the time, but
Mhm.
like cut across this idea of the Enlightenment that we have these discourses where we all say what we actually mean and we try to persuade each other to over the value of our point of view, whereas the other earlier forms of communication don't do that. They're relying on different limbics, kind of center in the brain kind of points where you're just ticking things off and generating a hormonal response as much as anything else to be able to kind of get people on side about things. So I just want the ethical aspect of that is tricky because when you talk to people in the climate movement, as it were, who are very averse to some of these things, they're more like, I just want to have like a debate and have like a straight up conversation about people with people and like try to persuade them to this point of view, as opposed to, oh, we don't do those sorts of things. That's what the other side does. I guess for me, that's what's interesting about the ethical challenges when it comes to climate communications in particular.
Okay, I see where we're going. I think this gets almost like into a political discussion right now, but I would say just like relevant for climate founders, even if you don't want to engage in certain activities, which you might deem unethical, I think it's still helpful to have a view of the world, of the view of politics, how like certain things are communicated. And my gut feeling is that over the past decade or so, certain norms within political communication have shifted very, very strongly.
Mm.
So maybe I'm just like too young to and not have seen that it was always that way. But it seems that in the past, at least, certain governments in certain countries, if you had a political agenda during your campaign, once you have been elected and set up an administration, you would follow through with it. Whereas right now, it seems there's a very clear distinction between campaign and actually governing, where the campaign is solely focused on hitting certain communication points that resonate well with the maximum amount of voters to get you into government. And once you're in government, you're saying like, well, screw you guys. That was all a joke. It's like what I said 2 months ago, and now we're doing things that are relevant right now. Well, yeah, regardless of whether you want to engage in it or not, it is happening. And so I think just having a more updated understanding of how maybe antagonistic parties around you are currently communicating and working
Right.
is helpful.
Interesting. Interesting. Okay. So, I mean, in terms of you're advising a lot of companies who work in the space, what are many of them getting wrong when it comes to comms, when it comes to branding, when it comes to narrative? Like, what are the common mistakes that you're seeing?
I would say two things primarily on a high level perspective, is just focusing on too many things. So thinking that you have to say everything and be everything to everyone all at once. But the problem is just noise. So how do you build a brand? You build a brand by the way I would define a brand is like it's a promise that you keep
Mhm.
over time. So you have something very clear. If my brand is, for example, being on time, the way I build my brand is I show up on
Being on
time
time.
for every
Right.
single meeting. And so if I don't show up on time, people might be like, oh, that's off brand. So it's not the promise that he
Right.
had kept. So I am suddenly someone who's known to being on time, someone who's like being funny, someone who's like doing this and that. It waters it down. So first of all, I think it's just to focus on something that you do well. So as you had mentioned previously, Peter Thiel had mentioned in 0 to 1 is by picking a niche and then trying to own that niche and
Hmm.
then expand from there. So I think especially in the startup stage where you are not, let's say, Microsoft, and you don't offer solutions to all sorts of organizations
Everything.
all across
Yeah.
the world, but you're probably a small company providing one or two things. Just figure out like
Hmm.
what's more important and then focus on that. And then on a more technical aspect is like how do you communicate it to your audience? The best words to choose when explaining something is like exactly the language of your customers. So if you ask them like, why do you use our products? Like why do you keep renewing it? Someone says it in their own words, just literally copy paste that onto your website. That's
Mm.
it. That's the verbiage that your customers use. So I would say those are the two things. Like one, not
And
being
so,
focused enough.
why don't people do that? I mean, like, why don't more companies, more founders, why don't they do that? Like, what holds them back? They just not think of it, or they're like, oh, they might say something I don't like. I mean, again, without the promise that you're going to put it on your website, but the idea of
Yep.
like, so why aren't more people doing it?
I don't think that's like no one answer, but sometimes it might be that founders are very smart and think that they have a more specific and better understanding of what's going on, and so they want to push a new term onto the market,
Right.
and the market
Right.
just like doesn't accept it. Sometimes it's just like a pure bandwidth issue. You have firefighting duties, you have to pay payroll, get sales done, hire people, asking the customers, and then also having the time and space to digest the information and place it onto your website or into your updated sales material, you might just not have the time for it. But the reason can be very, very different. But yeah, it just happens all the time. I see it all the time.
Slightly off theme question, and then I want to get back to talking a little bit about your background to kind of close us out. But I think in terms of the narratives that a lot of these companies are building, they are designed in many cases to go after venture capital. And in a lot of cases where they're having to promise that we're going to solve X and that there's going to be a return on investment of Y, and that return on investment actually is going to be a good story for you to be able to tell your LPs. And therefore, we could be the unicorn in your portfolio, which sometimes gets solutions providers into trouble later on, when it turns out they're not going to, do a 12x, 100x return because in fact, you're more like infrastructure. How do what do you tell your clients when you're helping them trying to navigate some of those challenges? Because again, it's like you want that bag, right? You need the money for expansion, but your temptation is to make a promise about what's going to be deliverable. And you wind up, I don't know, let's just say if you were a direct air capture company and putting money into advertising in the New York Times, get people to pay $30 a month to get a subscription about something that might happen in the future. I'm not going to mention any particular company names, but I think we know what we're talking about, where like, and now you've been called out later on, like a couple years in, where it's like, yeah, well, of course, we always said it's going to be 6 years out. Your credit is redeemed that you're paying for, and it's like I heard an interview on Bloomberg with someone asking that question, like, yeah, but you've buried it in like page 6 of your T's and C's, as opposed to like it being the UI up front. Say like when you buy, like you can't expect a return for 6 years, or you can't expect the thing you're paying for to happen for 6 years. So how do you help people navigate those dilemmas? Because obviously, we've all been you and I have been in that situation, I'm sure, where it's like you need to decide how you're going to close out a round and decide like whether or not you're going to take in the money and what you're going to say to make that happen. And some of the value statements that you're making have some levels of uncertainty that perhaps you're going to be tempted to try to minimize. So talk me through that. Talk me through the thinking, because I feel like that's the heart of the dilemma for a lot of founding teams, particularly in this space. So, give us your thoughts.
I would just preface that, like, if you're building a house of cards in a scammy business and you get found out, their business.
Yeah, neither of us are saying that.
Like, I'm also not saying like that particular direct air capture company is necessarily like a scammy business, but I'm just saying like if it's like to that end of the scale, then well, we don't engage in advising clients.
I think it's, but as a more general kind of rule, right? That tension's there, right, for a lot of these founders.
Yeah, and so I mean, if you are a startup, and a startup is a company that's trying to either introduce a new type of technology with a similar use case, or a old technology with a new use case, or maybe a combination of both. You're dealing with kind of scratching on the frontiers and you don't have all the information. So of course you might learn new information after you've raised a round, right? That's just like part of the business. It's also called venture capital because it carries a risk. So that's like why you have potentially outsized returns, but also the risk of the company completely failing. I think from the fundraising side, that's totally fine. And venture capitalists are professionals who take a calculated risk on their part. I think communicating the value or the potential value of your solution, I think if certain things are written in the T&Cs, I think that's fine, because most likely no client will, or like no potential customer will read the New York Times ad if it's like one sentence and then you have 500 rows of T&C terminology in font size 6.
Yeah.
So I think it's just about trying to figure out and strike the balance of kind of what are you trying to achieve? Communicate that first. Why should that be important to your potential customer? And then just add a couple of proof points to show that it's working. One thing I usually fill out with my clients is something that I call a narrative pyramid. And you can think of it as a one pager in an Excel sheet where you have at the very, very top, high level communication points, at the bottom, very detailed and granular communication points. So at the top, for example, the vision of the company. How does the world look like in 10 years time, according to you? What are we trying to optimize for? And then it cascades down into the mission. So like, how does the company fit into this vision of the world. At some point, you arrive at your customer, and then there are pain points. Below the pain points, you have the possible value propositions of your own products that feed into the pain points. And then you have reasons to believe or proof points that ideally underpin why your value proposition manages to solve their pain points. So if you can communicate that to the client, I think you're already in better shape than just licking your finger and putting it in the air and seeing like what happens.
Fair enough. Last couple of minutes there. Again, and thank you so much for your time, Art. It's been really great to chat. I hope you'll come back because I think there's so much more we could be getting into. But I want to, before I let you go, a couple of last things. You mentioned, your family fled the Yugoslav war, and you've written a lot about that experience. How does that shape the way you think about risk and the decision to move or not?
Interesting question. When talking about, let's say, the political and the security risks to Europe right now,
Hmm.
I'm actively thinking about it and thinking through different scenarios. Like, what happens if I get drafted? What happens if there is an actual attack on territory where I'm currently living in, and so on and so forth. So I do think it's like more top of mind than it might be for other people, where it's a little bit more abstract, just because due to my family
They've never been
history,
confronted with that.
it happened. Yeah.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
it's not abstract, it's very, very real. That's also one of the reasons why I'm interested in the space, because the reason why I think energy and climate is important is also to a large part for resilience and security reasons. So if we as Europe can manage to expand our renewable energy footprint paired with storage, then ideally we're less dependent on importing fossil fuels or any kind of other energy sources to help us be more resilient and more self-sufficient in the long run.
If someone is stuck at like a pivot or persevere moment, what's your advice to them? What do you want them to know?
Pivot or persevere? Good question. I think you should get all the relevant information in place. Kind of like, what's the actual situation that you're currently dealing with, and not just basing the decision on outdated information. So has the market actually shifted? Yes or no? Has your customer base actually changed something in their procurement process? Yes or no? Are the financing conditions different ones? Yes or no? Is the legal environment changing? Yes or no? Once you have all this information, you can make a significantly better decision. Pivoting the way you frame your solution is much easier and can still be done. If you suddenly find yourself in the business that is completely useless and the solution is irrelevant, or the purchasing conditions or the prices on the market are so that you cannot run your business, well, that's a tough decision and it's like a tough situation to find yourself in. But communication, I think anything can be solved, and I would just approach it like very methodically.
Final question. What's one framing or phrase you'd you'd get rid of forever? What would you say instead? Like what's thing you hear about?
Well, specifically in the energy system, I think the one solution fix to all the problems is just something that rubs me the wrong way. So if someone is saying, solar is the solution for everything, or nuclear is the solution for everything, or coal is the solution for everything, it's just not true. So energy systems are very, very complex, and they depend on a variety of factors. So what's the geography of the space? So do you have elevation? Yes or no? If yes, you can make hydro energy. Great. Um, is it a sunny place? Well, then you can make solar. But if it's cloudy, windy, and elevated, you have completely different circumstances with which you can generate your energy. Whereas in a place that's like a desert where you don't have any precipitation and
Right.
you can just mine the sun nonstop.
Well, let me push you on like two last things on that because, like, so net zero energy transition. People have been debating whether or not those terms have outlived their useful lives. So, what do you think about those?
Well, net zero is a conceptual frame. I like it because it just means that we emit on average as much as we suck out of the atmosphere, or that we don't emit anything, not sucking anything out. So I think as objective is measurable and very, very easy to grasp. I do like it. The way it's been used in policy making in Europe, I think, is useful because a lot of the new policy papers say like 40% reduction of like 1990 emissions or something like that. So I think it's like makes it very measurable. It's therefore very, very easy to understand. Some people might not like it, but I do think that zero is a helpful framing. Energy transition is also helpful, but I think it means very different things depending on which country you're in. So energy transition in, let's say, the Arab Emirates is very
Mm.
different than energy transition in Norway. Again, because the circumstances of the place dictate how the energy systems evolved. And so it just means very different things. So like going away from, let's say, burning fossil fuels versus in a country like Poland that is very, very close to Russia. And so therefore
Mhm.
does not import gas because of the tensions that they had over time. But they're very, very rich in coal. So that's like why you have so much coal in Poland, because they need to be energy resilient
Right. Right.
and use their domestic sources of energy. So yeah, I think both terms are useful. The latter one, energy transition, has just much more nuance to it.
Right. Well, look, I really enjoyed this conversation, Art. So thank you
Thank
for
you.
coming on. Founder of Delphi Zero, and again, so many other kind of things I could put on your CV, but I'm sure you'll send us some stuff to make sure that we can put links in the show notes. But anything you want to plug, anything we want to like as we close out, anything you want to mention that people should know about you or about what you're doing?
Well, first of all, let's keep fighting the good fight. So if you're listening to this conversation, make sure you're recommending Wicked Problems to your other friends.
Bless.
I think it's a worthwhile investment and time investments and purpose to go after these things. And I think like also economic opportunity wise, we'll see a lot more things happening in the next decade. As for my own stuff, so yeah, Delphi Zero, just like follow me on Substack. And one thing I'll be working on later this year is I'll be writing a book about communication called Clear and Consistent, as to how to strategize and how to create perfect narratives that also resonate with audiences.
Well, I hope you'll come back to talk about that. And my thanks again, Art Lapinsch, for coming on.
Thank you.
Have a great rest of your day.
Likewise.
Istanbul was Constantinople, now it's Istanbul, not Constantinople. Been a long time gone. Constantinople, now it's Turkish delight on a moonlit night. Every gal in Constantinople lives in Istanbul, not Constantinople. So if you've a date in Constantinople, she'll be waiting in Istanbul. Even old New York was once New Amsterdam. Why they changed it, I can't say. People just liked it better that way. So take me back to Constantinople. No, you can't go back to Constantinople. Been a long time gone. Constantinople, why did Constantinople get the works? That's nobody's business but the Turks.
Thanks for listening to Wicked Problems. If you liked this conversation, please share it and leave us a rating and review on Apple Podcasts or Spotify. It really helps people find the show. If you'd like an ad-free version of this podcast, consider becoming a paid subscriber at wickedproblems.earth. You'll also get our newsletter, all our show notes, member-only goodies, and you'll be supporting media that wants to tell the stories at the frontier of climate tech, the place where people and politics, technology and capital meet and shape the future. And whether it's one you'd want to live in. Wicked Problems is written and edited by Richard Delavan. Production assistance was provided by me, Theodore Delavan. Wicked Problems, Climate Tech Conversations, is a production of Wicked Problems Limited. Thanks again for listening.
So take me back to Constantinople. No, you can't go back to Constantinople. Been a long time gone. Constantinople, why did Constantinople get the works? That's nobody's business but the Turks. Istanbul.